My name's Jessica Cole. I'm 33 years old, and I've been working online for the past 6 years. What started as a few freelance gigs turned into a full-scale agency with clients in 4 countries. But to my family, I was still the one who sits on her laptop all day. Just last week, my aunt said, "You should really get a real job, like accounting or something." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just looked down at the check, sitting in the middle of the table after our annual family dinner. It had everything on it: my uncle's bourbon, the appetizers no one finished, and every overpriced dessert. I slid my card across the table. No speech, no eye contact, just action. When the waiter came back and said, "Thank you, Miss Cole, always a pleasure having you," the entire table went quiet. My brother stopped chewing. My mom finally asked, "Wait, you're paying for all of this?" I just nodded. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. I grew up in Rapid City, South Dakota, where the rhythm of life moved with the seasons and everyone knew your last name, where you came from, and often what you had for dinner. It was the kind of place where people took pride in the calluses on their hands and judged a person's worth by how early they got up for work. A hard day's labor meant something you could see: grease on a mechanic's overalls, dust on a farmer's boots, sweat on a construction worker's brow. My family was no different. My mother was a nurse who worked the night shift for years without ever complaining, and my father ran a small engine repair shop that he treated more like a sacred duty than a business. You didn't complain, you didn't ask for help, and you certainly didn't brag. You worked. That was the rule. As a child, I fit into this structure quietly. I helped where I could, stayed out of trouble, and made decent enough grades. But I was always elsewhere. While the kids around me dreamed about pickup trucks and county fairs, I was making collages out of magazine ads and trying to figure out how websites worked on our slow, clunky desktop computer. I wasn't social in the traditional sense, but I found something deeply comforting about building things that didn't require hammers or gasoline. I liked creating stories, editing photos, even teaching myself basic HTML from a dusty library book. But to the adults around me, none of that mattered. They saw it as a phase, or worse, a hobby. As I got older, the disconnect grew. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to marry my high school boyfriend and live 3 streets away from my parents. I didn't want a safe job with a steady paycheck if it meant being miserable every Monday. I wanted freedom, not just physical, but mental. I wanted to decide how I worked, where I worked, and who I worked with. That made me sound ungrateful to some of my relatives. They thought I was too good for our town. I wasn't, I just wanted a different life. By the time I was 25, I had moved out and was experimenting with freelancing. Small projects here and there, social media management for a friend's online shop, simple website redesigns. Nothing fancy, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in years: control. Still, when I came back home for holidays or family events, it was like none of it existed. My brother had a job in finance, which automatically made him a success in everyone's eyes. My cousin worked in construction: good, solid, honest labor. And then there was me. Still figuring things out, they'd say. Still on the computer, they'd joke. I laughed too, even though it stung. Because in their world, if you didn't wear a uniform or clock into a building, your work wasn't real. It wasn't that they were cruel. It was just what they knew. They measured success by visibility and effort, by hours worked and income claimed on a W-2. What I did had no shape to them, no form, so they filled in the blanks with assumptions. That I was broke, that I was confused, that I was playing around with no direction. And for a long time, I let them believe that. Until I didn't. There's something exhausting about constantly having to explain that what you do isn't just a hobby, especially when the people you're explaining it to are the ones who helped raise you. For years, my job was something I tiptoed around at family gatherings. When someone asked, I'd say, "I do digital work," or "I freelance online," hoping it would be vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. But there were always follow-ups. And smirks. And that one comment someone would make that made my stomach twist just a little. They didn't mean harm, I kept telling myself. When my aunt would say, "It's great you have something to keep you busy," I'd nod. When my cousin said, "So it's kind of like a side hustle," I'd smile. I'd listen to them talk about their salaried positions, their HR complaints, their long commutes, and I'd sit there quietly, sipping from a paper cup like a teenager, waiting to be dismissed. The assumption was always the same. I was doing this until something real came along. A real job, a real office, a real salary. What they didn't know, what I never told them, was that I had already passed most of them in income. Quietly, I'd signed contracts with brands they saw in commercials, managed launches for products they probably used. I'd led teams across time zones, negotiated retainers in 5 figures, learned to build things from the ground up, all from my laptop. But still, to them it was cute. They called it flexible. They called it modern. They called it creative. But they never called it legitimate. Not the way they talked about my brother's job at a regional bank or my cousin's promotion in the insurance office. That was stable. That was respectable. Me, I was still playing on the internet. I tried at first to make them understand. I showed them one of my campaigns, a wellness brand I'd rebranded that had gone viral. My uncle scrolled past it, unimpressed. "Yeah, but how do you get paid for that?" I tried explaining the value of clicks, conversions, contracts. Their eyes glazed over. I gave up. Eventually, I stopped trying. I built my business in silence. I hired my first contractor without telling anyone. Then a second. Then a team. I invested in software, workflows, systems. I learned about taxes and scaling and client retention. I taught myself to delegate and detach. I turned my apartment into a headquarters. I hit revenue goals I never thought possible, not just for someone like me, but for anyone I knew. And still, when I came home, it was Jessica's internet thing. The more I grew, the smaller I let myself seem, at least around them. It was easier than constantly defending my work. Easier than performing credibility in a language they didn't understand. But it was lonely, and a little unfair. Because while they dismissed it as a phase, I was building a business brick by brick, not with my hands, but with my brain, my time, my discipline. They didn't see the hours, the stress, the missed meals, the contracts I'd agonized over. All they saw was a girl with a laptop. A girl who must be playing. They called it a hobby, but I was building an empire. Thanksgiving had always been a rigid ritual in our family. The date never changed, the location never moved, and the guest list was practically carved in stone. Dinner was held at my Aunt Cheryl's house, a big colonial-style home just outside of town, with a long gravel driveway and a sunroom no one was allowed to sit in. The same folding table was added every year to make room for the growing head count. The same cranberry sauce from a can was sliced into perfect rings. The same arguments about politics would start somewhere between the mashed potatoes and dessert. It was scripted chaos, and everyone knew their lines. I hadn't missed a single year, not even the one when I had the flu and sat in a corner wrapped in a scarf. That year, my presence was more important than my health. Family comes first, they always said, which sounded noble until you realized it meant show up or we'll talk about you like you're dead. This year, though, felt different before it even began. I hadn't been back home in months. I'd been busy expanding my client base, onboarding 2 new team members, and finalizing a long-term retainer with a company I used to admire from afar. My life was moving fast, but silently. I hadn't posted about it, hadn't shared much outside of the curated slice on Instagram, mostly because no one in my family ever seemed interested. When I mentioned my work, it felt like bringing up a foreign language at a dinner table, where everyone spoke in numbers and hourly wages. Still, I RSVP'd yes like I always did. The week before, I received the usual reminder text from my cousin Jen. Same time, same place, bring whatever you want, just don't forget the dessert like last year. I baked a pecan pie the night before. I even ironed my one presentable blouse, because heaven forbid I show up looking like I worked from a coffee shop all day, which I often did. When I arrived, everything looked exactly the same, which meant I didn't belong in it anymore. The house buzzed with voices I recognized but no longer felt connected to. My cousin's kids had grown taller. My uncle had grown louder. The same jokes were being passed around, but the punchlines hit differently now. They weren't funny anymore. They were predictable. I sat in my usual spot end of the table, halfway between the kids and the kitchen. Someone made a comment about how I still hadn't figured out what I wanted to do. My mother redirected with a story about my brother's recent promotion. I nodded, passed the rolls, and kept my hands folded on my lap. I watched the room like an outsider watches a stage. Then, at some point between the stuffing and the pie, my aunt turned to me with a kind smile that didn't match her words. "It's really good that you've found something to keep you busy," she said. "The internet is such a creative space these days." The comment wasn't cruel. That was the worst part. It was so gentle, it barely registered to everyone else. But to me, it landed like a punch. A reminder that no matter how far I'd come, in their eyes, I was still the girl with a laptop and a hobby, someone who lived in the margins of the real world. No one asked about my business. No one asked what I was building. They asked if I was dating anyone, if I'd thought about moving back, if I'd ever considered going back to school for something stable. I smiled. I nodded. I said I was happy. And then I started planning. Not out of anger, not even out of pride, but because I realized, sitting there surrounded by well-meaning people who thought I was wasting my potential, that the only way they'd ever understand was if I stopped explaining and just showed them. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this would be the last Thanksgiving I'd spend shrinking to fit into someone else's version of success. I finished my pie. I cleared my plate. I kissed my mother on the cheek. And I left before coffee was served. It started as a suggestion, a throwaway comment from my cousin Ben in the group chat. "Let's do dinner downtown next month, something nice." He added a winking emoji and tagged a trendy new place that had just opened in the historic district. The kind of restaurant with too much mood lighting and single-word menu items that didn't come with descriptions. I hadn't heard of it, but I looked it up, scanned the website, and smiled. It wasn't just trendy, it was expensive. Reservation only. Prefix. Chef's tasting menu. The kind of place people took clients to, or reserved for anniversaries. And there it was, floating in our family thread between a meme and a debate about football. An invite. For once I wasn't invisible. I replied, "Sounds great," and left it at that. I didn't ask who made the reservation. I didn't volunteer to bring dessert. I just waited. And when the date was set, I rearranged 2 client meetings and booked a blowout at a salon I usually avoided for being too pricey. But this time, I wanted every detail to be intentional, sharp, clean. The hostess recognized our name when I arrived. My cousin had used hers, of course, not mine. I wasn't surprised. We were seated at a long table near the window, the city lights glittering behind us like we were inside someone else's story. Everyone was dressed up, laughing too loudly, posting photos they'd later crop me out of. I didn't care. I was watching. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of calm detachment, like I already knew how this night would end, even if they didn't. The meal was gorgeous. Too gorgeous, really. The kind that made you hesitate before taking the first bite. Microgreens, gold flakes, bubbles of sauce that looked like art supplies. The wine flowed, and so did the stories, vacations they'd taken, bosses they hated, kids they couldn't understand. I chimed in occasionally, but mostly I listened. Absorbed. Took note. And then came the moment. It always does. The server approached at the end, a small leather booklet in his hand. He placed it gently at the center of the table, and for one full beat, no one moved. The room got quieter, not completely, just enough to feel it. My uncle shifted in his chair. My cousin's husband reached for his wallet. Theatrically slow, and then the question that always comes at moments like these floated into the air like it had a script of its own. So who's covering this one? It wasn't directed at me. It never was. There was laughter, half-hearted offers, and one exaggerated joke from my brother about splitting it by net worth. That's when I moved. I reached forward, calmly, confidently, and slid the booklet toward me. No flourish, no smirk. I took out my card, the one with the platinum edge, the one they didn't know I had, and placed it neatly inside. The server returned. He took the booklet, nodded, and left. Silence, then confusion, then that rising murmur of disbelief masked as humor. "You got that?" someone asked, laughing, like it was a dare. I didn't answer. The server returned a minute later with the receipt and a small note. He placed it in front of me, then said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "Thank you again, Ms. Jensen. Always an honor having you with us." The table froze. It wasn't just the check anymore, it was the acknowledgement. They looked at me differently then, like I had slipped out of whatever box they'd built for me years ago and grown into someone they hadn't been paying attention to. No one said thank you. No one offered to Venmo their share. They just sat there, quiet and blinking, like the room had shifted on its axis. I signed the receipt, took a sip of my wine, and finally smiled, because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one explaining my worth. The room already knew. The silence after the bill was paid didn't vanish. It lingered. Heavy, tense, almost embarrassed, like the room had expected a punchline that never came. I could feel eyes on me, though no one met mine directly. They were darting glances over their wine glasses, suddenly invested in crumbs on their plates, in anything but acknowledging what had just happened. I had said nothing. I didn't need to, and that absence of explanation, of performance, seemed to rattle them more than any speech could have. The power of stillness, of action without justification, was louder than I expected. As the group stood to leave, the usual chorus of polite goodbyes was stifled. Someone muttered a half-hearted, "Thanks for dinner," not even looking at me. Another said, "We should do this again," the way people say it when they have no intention of doing so. But most just filed out quietly, like they didn't want to disturb something they couldn't understand. The valet brought my car around my car, paid in full, and I drove off without turning on the radio. I didn't need noise. Not tonight. Back home, I kicked off my heels, set my purse down, and stared at the ceiling from the couch. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. Not exactly. It was something more grounded, settled. A sense of having shifted the axis of my story just slightly, but permanently. No fireworks, no applause, just quiet transformation. The kind that sticks. The next morning, my phone lit up with a few messages. Not from the people I expected, not apologies, not acknowledgments. Just comments that tried to sweep last night under the rug. "Nice seeing everyone," one text said in the group thread. Another sent a selfie from the table with a sarcastic caption about the dessert. They were already rewriting it. Already pretending that the moment the look on their faces when the server said my name hadn't happened. That's how people like them protected their narratives. By ignoring the data points that didn't fit. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop, checked the dashboard of my business portal, and watched the revenue tick upward from overnight purchases. A client had closed a project early and left a 5-figure tip. An old blog post had gone viral again. One of my templates had been featured in a tech newsletter. My world was moving, expanding regardless of whether they looked or not. That realization brought a calm I hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. By afternoon, my mom called. She didn't mention the dinner. She asked about the weather, about my dog, about a show she started watching. It was the softest olive branch. I let her talk. When she hesitated, waiting, maybe, for me to mention the elephant in the room, I didn't. I gave her nothing. Not because I was angry, but because I was tired of explaining a story that spoke for itself now. What none of them seemed to understand was that I hadn't paid for dinner to prove anything to them. Not really. I'd done it because I could. Because I wanted to. Because every time I'd been underestimated, every time someone had said, "That's not a real job," or laughed when I mentioned what I did, I'd filed it away. And now, I'd responded not with words, but with results. Later that week, I was interviewed on a podcast about digital entrepreneurship. The host asked about family support. I paused. Then I said, "I think silence is a form of support too. It teaches you to clap for yourself." The episode got thousands of downloads. I received messages from strangers saying they finally felt seen. And that's when it hit me. What had felt like isolation for so long was actually training. All the dismissals, the sideways glances, the jokes, they were pressure. And pressure, I'd learned, could make something collapse or crystallize. I chose the latter. The funny thing about browser tabs is how we leave them open, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, with no intention of clicking back. We let them linger in the background, cluttering the edge of our screen, whispering something we're not yet ready to deal with. That's what the invoice tab had become. I had opened it the day after the family dinner, when I saw the transaction in my business credit account and realized the restaurant bill had already been posted. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the pause, the gap, that tiny space between what they thought they knew and what they'd now have to reconcile. I kept that tab open, like a wound left unbandaged, visible, intentional, healing at its own pace. I didn't send a screenshot to anyone. I didn't tweet about it. I didn't frame the receipt like some trophy. But I did stare at it a few times a day, reminding myself that I didn't imagine what happened, that it wasn't some dream or dramatic overreaction, that I really did pay for that table of 9 people, including the wine my aunt had ordered with a condescending smile. The total wasn't outrageous, a few $100s, but the emotional debt they owed me was far bigger. And the only repayment I'd ever accept was silence, which I had in spades. It wasn't long before the silence cracked. My cousin Emma messaged me midweek. Not about dinner, of course. She wanted help setting up a Substack. Said she remembered I did stuff online and was trying to turn her journaling hobby into something more. I smiled at the phrasing. Did stuff online. It was like saying someone who built bridges just messed around with metal. I didn't correct her. I sent her a template I'd made months ago. She replied with, "Wow, thanks," and nothing else. I knew that template would probably help her more in 2 hours than my entire family had helped me in 2 years. And yet I gave it freely. Because that's the difference between them and me. I move forward. I don't gatekeep my progress out of spite. But I do remember who never clapped. By Thursday, I had toggled that receipt tab into a different kind of reminder. I left it there, quietly occupying the edge of my screen, like a ghost of everything unspoken. In between Zoom calls with clients in London and Shopify reports for 2 e-commerce brands, I'd glimpsed the total again, $672.43. Not life-changing, but story-changing. That number now belonged to the version of me who no longer felt the need to shrink at the dinner table, the version who could sit, quiet and upright, without performing smallness just to fit their expectations. And yet, something in me still waited for the next micro-dig, the next subtle dismissal. I wasn't paranoid, just prepared. I'd spent so many years navigating these rooms with invisible armor that now, standing tall without it, I felt both raw and free. The freedom was louder. And that mattered more. A few days later, my mom sent a forwarded article, 10 Flexible Careers for Modern Women. No comment, no link to me, just the article. I didn't click it, I didn't need to. I knew what it meant. She was dipping a toe into the water, testing if it was safe to acknowledge what I did, without saying the words, "I was wrong." I gave her grace in my mind but no reply. Not yet. Let her sit in that tab a little longer. Meanwhile, the team I built was crushing goals. We closed 3 new contracts that week. I onboarded a junior designer I'd been mentoring. And I got invited to speak at a digital conference in Chicago. I kept saying yes to the world, while my family still wondered if my job was just Wi-Fi and vibes. One night, after a particularly good client call, I closed all my browser tabs. Every last one. Except that one. The dinner bill. I stared at it again. Not with bitterness. With clarity. That number wasn't a burn mark anymore. It was a timestamp. A quiet record of the moment I stopped needing to be seen and started choosing who I'd let see me. When I finally closed it, I whispered something out loud. Just a few words. Soft. For me. Something like, "That'll do." And the screen went quiet. It was a Thursday evening when I heard my name said with more weight than usual. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I didn't need to be. It came from my cousin Lena, who, according to her text, had been talking to my dad. She said he mentioned you, called you the tech one. That's a first. I stared at her message for a long time, unsure what to do with it. My name, in his mouth, without sarcasm, without air quotes. Just said. Maybe not with pride, but certainly with recognition. That was new. Names carry stories. But mine had always been a whisper at family gatherings. A formality. A checkbox. They'd say it the way you say napkin or coaster. A thing around the table, but not central to it. Now, it lingered in the air like the scent of something cooking. Not acknowledged directly, but changing the flavor of the room. And I wondered, had they started to say my name differently because they saw it on a receipt? On a card? On a LinkedIn announcement one of them accidentally clicked? It wasn't that I craved praise. I stopped expecting that when I realized most of my family measured worth in job titles they understood and salaries they could brag about to their church friends. What I wanted was clarity, a crack in the silence, a pause in the performance, something honest. Something that sounded like, "We see you now." But I knew better than to wait for confessions. People like my dad didn't say I was wrong. They said things like, "Well, looks like you're doing okay," and expected that to count as closure. Later that weekend, we had another small family event, a birthday barbecue for my nephew. I showed up with a modest gift and no expectations. The air was thick with smoke and laughter, and I kept to the edge of the yard, sipping lemonade. That's when it happened again. My uncle introduced me to a neighbor. "This is Jess," he said, nodding. "She's, the one with the online business, real smart." It wasn't much, but it was different. Different than the girl who works from home, or the one always on her laptop. There was intent in his pause, like he was searching for a way to say it right. I let it slide with a nod, though inside me, something adjusted. A knot shifted. And then the waiter. Yes, again. Not the same place, not the same table. This was a random Tuesday lunch with my mom at a local cafe. I'd taken the afternoon off because I'd hit every milestone that week and felt like spoiling myself with a good sandwich and a quiet booth. My mom invited herself along. I didn't mind. We sat, chatted about surface things, her neighbor's new fence, my cousin's engagement, until the check came. I reached for it, casually. The waiter smiled and said, "Miss Cole, thank you again. You're always so kind to our staff." My mom blinked. I could see her process it, the familiarity, the tone, The implication that I was a regular, that I tipped well, that I had a presence in places they didn't think I belonged. She said nothing at first, just lifted her glass, took a sip, and looked out the window. The moment passed like a breeze, but I caught it. The pause. The slow nod. Not agreement, not apology, just acknowledgement. And that, to me, was louder than anything else. It wasn't just the name on the receipt, it was the reputation that traveled with it. The stories that waiters, clients, colleagues, and now maybe even family started to carry when they said Jessica. The shift from, oh, her, to, oh, her. That night, I updated my business bio. Not because of them, but because of me. Because somewhere between the dinner I paid for and the silence that followed, I realized my name had grown. It no longer fit inside their old definitions. It echoed louder now. In boardrooms, in inboxes, in wait lists and invoices. And yes, even in the mouths of those who used to laugh. They didn't say much, but they said my name. And sometimes, that's the only sentence you need. It's strange how success doesn't hit you like a single moment. It's not like in the movies, where someone gets a call, or a giant check, or a standing ovation. At least, it wasn't like that for me. For me, it was slower, quieter. It built itself like sediment, layer by layer, until one day I looked around and realized I wasn't playing a role anymore. I was it. I wasn't trying to run a business. I was a businesswoman. Not a freelancer, not someone who dabbled in side gigs. I had employees, clients, contracts, infrastructure. I had something real. And what surprised me most was how natural it felt once I stopped apologizing for it. I remember sitting in my workspace one evening, not even late, just that golden hour when the sun sinks low and everything in the room gets soft, and realizing I hadn't heard anyone question what I do in months. Not from friends, not from clients, and not even from family. I had booked a new client that morning, onboarded a junior account manager the week before, and my calendar was full through the next quarter. The only voice that still hesitated was mine. The echo of that old conditioning, whispering that maybe it was all temporary, that at any moment someone would find out I wasn't qualified, that I was still, in their eyes, just the girl who works online. But the numbers didn't lie. The testimonials didn't lie. The bills paid on time didn't lie. The referrals and partnerships and renewals, they all told me what I hadn't fully believed for too long. I belonged here. I earned this. No one gifted it to me, and no one could take it away. What changed everything for me wasn't a single milestone, but a shift in how I entered rooms. Before, I used to downplay what I did. I'd say I work online with a half smile, bracing myself for the inevitable follow-up. Oh, like TikTok or something. Or, so you just sit at home. But now, when someone asked, I answered simply, I run a digital strategy firm. And I left it at that. No explanation, no defensive tone. If they were curious, they'd ask. If they weren't, that was fine too. That shift from justifying to owning was everything. It bled into how I dressed. I used to wear comfortable to meetings, hoodies, and jeans, as if I had to look casual to be taken seriously. Now, I wore what made me feel powerful. Tailored jackets, clean silhouettes, subtle jewelry. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because it reminded me of the version of myself I had built. She was no longer hiding. She was arriving. It also changed how I handled disrespect. A client once delayed payment for over a month. Before, I would have written a gentle reminder, waited another week, maybe absorbed the loss. But this time, I sent a single email with legal language and an attached invoice. Paid in 3 hours, no apology, no excuses, just results. One of the biggest moments came not at work, but during a video call with my cousin Sam. He had just been laid off and wanted advice on starting freelance work. Midway through the call, he said, "You really figured this out, huh?" I remember when they used to say you were just messing around. I didn't even have to ask who they were. I just nodded and gave him the same advice no one gave me. Start small, stay consistent, and never let people who don't pay your bills define your path. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. Not because it was some emotional reconciliation, but because it was the first time someone from before admitted they'd seen the difference. That they knew. It wasn't about praise, it was about recognition. The shift had reached them too. There's a different kind of silence now when I walk into family events. Not icy, not judgmental, just measured, watchful, as if they're all waiting for a cue they missed the first time around. I don't give them one. I just sit down, take a sip of wine, and ask about their lives. I smile, I listen, and I don't correct anyone anymore when they say, "She runs her own thing." Because yes, I do. And it's not a thing, it's a business, it's a life, it's a role I've stepped into fully no script, no understudy, no apology. I had spent so many years trying to make them understand. Now I realized I didn't need them to. I just needed to live it loudly, fully, and unapologetically. The true test didn't come from trolls on the internet or difficult clients. It came from my own family, and it was served quietly, behind tight smiles and casual comments wrapped in concern. They never directly said they didn't believe in me anymore. They didn't need to. Their silence did the talking. It started with the way they still hesitated to ask about my work during family gatherings. Everyone had questions for my cousin who just got hired at a law firm, or for my brother who managed a car dealership. But me, I was the one with all that computer stuff. They still weren't sure if I was unemployed or running a scam. No one said it, but it showed in their eyes, in the way they smiled too politely when I mentioned a client's name or an upcoming launch. Then came the real moment. My uncle, the same one who once asked me if I actually make money from that internet thing, called. He said my younger cousin wanted to start a little online gig and asked if I could give him a few tips. I agreed, of course, not because I owed them anything, but because I remembered what it was like to start with no map. The call was short. He barely listened. He asked how long it took me to start making real money. I said, 5 years. He winced. Then he said, maybe it wasn't for him. I hung up and stared at my screen for a long time. Not because I was hurt, but because I realized how deep the disbelief ran even after all this time, even with receipts, results, and a business that ran itself when I needed space. And yet, the universe works with timing. That same week, I got a call from one of my longest-standing clients, a healthcare startup I had worked with from the ground up. They were acquired by a global brand, and my name had been passed up the ladder. Suddenly, I wasn't just the contractor. I was being offered a partnership retainer. The numbers had commas in places I'd never imagined. I signed the contract that night, heart steady, hand firm. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't post online. I just took a breath, closed my laptop, and made a note on my whiteboard. Stability is silent. But the real test came when I decided to do something for myself, something tangible. I had spent years reinvesting every cent, back into my business team, tools, systems. Now it was time to invest in visibility. I hired a PR firm. I gave a podcast interview. I started working on a keynote for a digital entrepreneurs summit. I showed my face literally and figuratively. The response wasn't immediate, but it came in waves. A former classmate messaged me, stunned. A woman I met once at a co-working space reached out to say she remembered my energy. An email came in from a college professor who said she used my podcast as a case study for self-made branding. None of these things paid a bill, but they paid something else. Validation I never knew I still needed. That weekend, I visited my parents. My mom had framed a photo of my brother standing in front of his new truck. It was hanging near the kitchen. Nothing of mine was in sight. But over dinner, my dad asked if I was still doing that business thing. I said yes. I said we'd just opened our 4th retainer in under a month. He nodded, quietly. My mom passed the salad like nothing had changed. But something had. When dessert came, my niece, 12 years old, with too much curiosity to hold back, asked me what I do. Before I could answer, my brother said, "She's a boss. Like, for real. She signs checks now." Everyone laughed. But this time, it wasn't mocking. It wasn't awkward. It was warm. Like, the idea of me being capable finally landed somewhere they could touch. I didn't correct him. I didn't soften it. I just smiled and said, "That's pretty close." The test wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about seeing if I'd stay grounded in who I'd become, even when surrounded by people who once made me question it. Turns out, I could. The strange thing about working online is that your success often happens behind closed tabs. It's not like buying a building or opening a storefront. There's no ribbon-cutting ceremony or grand opening where everyone can clap and take pictures. There's just a silent notification from Stripe, or a Slack message from a happy client, or a new logo draft reviewed over Zoom. It's real, but intangible, and for people like my family that made it hard to believe. By the time I reached year 7 of my business, I had revenue consistency, a small team, systems running almost independently, and more inbound requests than I could handle. But to the outside world, especially my family, it still looked like I was on my laptop again. I could have been watching YouTube or doom scrolling for all they knew. There was no visual difference between me closing a 5-figure consulting deal and someone procrastinating on Facebook. That's when I realized the core problem wasn't their malice. It was the invisibility of my life. They had no way to measure it. No proof to hold in their hands. No product to buy or billboard to see. I didn't exist in their world of yard signs and 401ks. I lived in digital invoices and Dropbox folders. My biggest wins lived in the cloud. So when the offer came in for me to appear as a featured speaker on a Women in Tech Business Summit, I hesitated. Not because I wasn't ready, I was, but because stepping into that kind of public space meant finally letting the rest of the world see what had been happening behind the curtain. And part of me, I admit, was afraid of being exposed to more doubt, but I said yes. The event was held in Chicago, in a venue that had real spotlights, velvet curtains, and rows of chairs filled with real people. My panel was titled "From Freelance to Founder, Building in the Shadows." When I stepped on stage, I could feel every bone in my body wanting to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But I stood tall, adjusted the mic, and started telling the story. Not the shiny version, the real one. About the 2 a.m. panic attacks before client launches. About the times I overdrafted my account just to pay a contractor on time. About working out of a rented basement studio and pretending it was a creative lab. And about how my family still thought I was unemployed for the first 2 years, even when I was quietly matching my old manager's salary. After the talk, a line formed. Women young, middle-aged, even some in their 60s, came up to say they saw themselves in my story. One whispered, "I thought I was the only one whose family didn't get it." Another handed me a business card and said, "I want to hire you to teach my team how you did this. You've got receipts." But the moment that stuck with me came from a college-age girl who said, "You make me believe I don't have to wait for permission." That night, I flew home quietly. No announcement, no airport selfie, no new follower count check. I ordered Thai food, pulled my hair into a bun, and sat on my living room floor with my laptop. And I smiled, because all those years, I thought being invisible was a weakness. Turns out, it was my advantage. I built in peace. I learned without judgment. I earned without performance. And now, I could choose when and how I showed up. I didn't need to prove anything, but I could, if I wanted to. The camera may not have always been on me, but I never stopped directing the story. There was a moment, sometime around mid-November, when I realized I hadn't spoken to my mother in over 6 weeks. Not because of any specific argument or dramatic falling out, just silence. A quiet drift apart that had started years ago, back when she asked what I really did, and I said, "I work online." She had chuckled. I had smiled politely. And something had quietly fractured between us, not sharp, not loud, just subtle enough that it didn't bleed. But it bruised. The irony of that distance was that I now found myself closer to strangers than I'd ever been to my own family. My team, my clients, even my podcast listeners, they knew more about my values, my process, my triumphs and fears, than the people who shared my last name. And yet, that family still held a strange power over me, like a name on a credit card I no longer used but couldn't bring myself to cancel. So when I got the envelope, cream-colored and thick, with gold-embossed edges, I knew it was from them. An invitation, not to apologize, not to reconnect. Together. Thanksgiving. Again. Hosted at my aunt's place this time. Formal, it said. Bring wine. No note. No. Hope to see you. Just a date and time and address. I stared at it for a long time. The thing that struck me most wasn't what it said. It was what it didn't. No acknowledgement of my life. No curiosity. No sign they had read the interview I gave to Forbes last month, where I'd spoken about running a remote-first consultancy, scaling past 7 figures, and mentoring women who'd been dismissed just like I once was. They hadn't seen it, or worse, had, and chosen silence. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was resolved. That night, I opened my laptop and started drafting an invoice, not for them, but for the catering company I was hiring to prepare dinner for my team. Not a flashy gesture. Just a moment of gratitude. I wanted to celebrate too. Just not where my name was still treated like a question mark. Still, part of me wondered if I'd go. Not for them, for myself. Maybe to close a loop. To take up space in a room that had always whispered I was extra. Unnecessary. Out of place. The decision came unexpectedly. I was on a Zoom call with a client, a woman 10 years older than me, navigating her own pivot. At the end of the call, she said, "Thank you. You make me feel like I don't need anyone's permission to succeed." I paused, smiled, and it hit me. That was it. That's what had always been missing in my family. Not love, not presence. Permission. The belief that I was allowed to succeed, that my success didn't need to fit their narrative to be valid, that I didn't need a signature at the bottom of the metaphorical page saying approved by blood. So I RSVP'd no. I donated what I would have spent on flights and wine to a local coding program for girls. And on Thanksgiving, I made my own dinner. Quiet, intentional, full of warmth and noise from people who had chosen me, not inherited me. There was no applause, no dramatic toast, but as I sipped my wine and scrolled through emails, I saw a message from the program's director, a thank you. They were naming one of the new laptops after me. The Jessica. I laughed. Because maybe I didn't need a signature. Maybe I'd become one. It's strange how silence used to feel like defeat. For so long, I thought not speaking up meant I was letting them win, that every time I smiled through a passive-aggressive jab or looked away from a smirk during dinner, I was giving something up. My place, my value, my dignity. But now, in a hotel conference room on the second floor of a convention center in Minneapolis, I understood something new. Silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it was power. The stage wasn't fancy, just a carpeted riser with a wooden podium and 2 spotlights that made the room feel warmer than it was. I stood backstage with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening to the moderator read my bio. Jessica Cole is the founder and CEO of Cole Collective, a remote-first digital strategy firm that has scaled globally in under 5 years. Today, she joins us to talk about building without approval and finding clarity in noise. Applause. Soft, then stronger. I stepped out. The lights caught me, and I blinked not from nerves, but from recognition. This was mine. My moment. And not because someone else gave it to me, or finally decided I was worthy of it, but because I built it. Day by day, client by client, invoice by invoice, doubt by doubt. As I looked out at the sea of faces, mostly women, some young, some older, all watching with open curiosity, I remembered sitting in my childhood bedroom, applying to freelance jobs in secret. My father downstairs watching the news, my mother folding laundry, my brother loudly sharing his latest promotion at the bank. None of them ever asked what I was doing. I used to wonder if they even wanted to know. Now, it didn't matter, I told the story. Not all the details. Not the awkward dinners. Not the invisible RSVPs. Not the cold shoulders or half laughs. But enough. Enough for them to see that this wasn't just about business or branding or social media. It was about being seen. Not validated, just seen. And about what happens when you stop waiting for someone else to offer you a seat and decide to build your own damn table. I saw eyes widen, heads nod. People were leaning in, writing things down. One woman had tears in her eyes. I kept going about boundaries, about choosing clients who valued you, about firing your first big name when they treated your time like it was optional, about charging what you're worth, and then adding tax, about letting your numbers speak when your voice shakes. And when I wrapped up, I paused, not for effect, but because I felt something settle inside me, like a click in a lock. "Thank you," I said. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't a stadium roar. But it was real, deep, steady, and I felt it in my spine. Afterward, in the lounge outside the conference room, a young woman came up to me, maybe 23, with a notebook in hand and anxiety in her eyes. She whispered, "How did you keep going when no one believed in you?" I looked at her, really looked at the tight grip on her pen, at the uncertainty tucked beneath her lipstick, at the question I'd once asked myself 100 times in silence. "I stopped needing them to," I said. Her shoulders dropped, like she'd been waiting to exhale. That night, I didn't go home to a house full of family. I went back to my hotel, ordered room service, and sat by the window watching snow fall over the city. My phone buzzed a message from a past client. "Saw you were speaking in Minneapolis. Just wanted to say congrats. You were always the real deal." No signature. No emojis. Just that. I closed my laptop. Let the quiet settle. Because sometimes, the loudest moment of your life is the one no one else sees, and for once, I was okay with that.